Assalamu alaikum, my friends. Welcome back to another episode of us drawing out the Qur'an, your timeline. Marriage Muhyiddin here. Excited to be with you because today's a day that we're going to finish. We're going to finish the Qur'an, your timeline. Now let's take a look at what we've accomplished so far. We have talked about the early Meccan quadrant, the late Meccan quadrant, the early Medinan quadrant. That's where we left off. And we talked about this very difficult time, remember, where we said this mnemonic, the Hijrah, resulted in battle upon battle till Hudaybiyah. That's what happened. And we use that mnemonic to draw out these events right here. And if you have any questions about that, you can always go back to the previous video, learn that, review that, and then when you're ready, jump into this video here. But for today, we're going to kind of clear out all this stuff right here. Let's do that. And now we're going to talk about this period of the late Medinan period. So let's talk about late Medina. So remember, the first step that we have to do is we have to kind of create the 6 hash marks here. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to do these equidistant hash marks. So we're going to cut this half into thirds and then this half into thirds, just like this. And we got to make them look nice because that's important. Like that. And let's number this now. So we had 19 here, so this is 20, 21, 22, 23. Now remember, this Qur'an year is only 23 years. It's not 24 years. So let's get rid of that 24. Boom. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So we have these last 5 years, which is we're going to call the late Medinan period. I'm going to put this out here because we're talking about this late Medinan quadrant. So if you remember from the story, this was the most difficult period, the third Qur'an year, right? The third quadrant. What happened is we said the 4th H takes place. Well, let's write that back in, which is the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. So let's write that here, H-D-A-Y. Hudaybiyah is this treaty that happens between the Prophet and the Muslims and the Quraysh. After all this fighting and difficulty and so forth, the Prophet, peace upon him, and his followers, they come to a treaty, a peace treaty, kind of what would you call a ceasefire, where they decide, look, we're tired of the fighting. No one wants it. The Meccans don't want it. The Muslims are tired of feeling like they're always being attacked. And they said, let's just come to a 10-year truce where you guys don't fight us, we don't fight you. Like, let's just go our separate ways for 10 years. And this treaty is called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which happens in year 19. We know that. It's one of the 4 H's, Hira, Hamza, Hijra, and Hudaybiyah. Now, what happens at the Treaty of Hudaybiyah is that there's several terms to the treaty, and it was a fairly lopsided treaty, or so it seemed. And it was like giving the Meccans the upper hand, and the Muslims felt like they were having the lower hand in this treaty. But this was divinely scripted. And this is very clearly discussed in the Qur'an. In Surah Fath, it talks about the victory of Hudaybiyah, which wasn't obvious at the time, but actually played out so much in the benefit of the Muslims. And so the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, one of the terms of the treaty is that you cannot fight, not only are we not fighting each other, but we can't fight the enemy's allies. So like this person, the Meccans can't fight the Muslims, but the Meccans also can't fight the Muslims' allies, and the Muslims can't fight the Meccans' allies. Like everything, there's no fighting between our allies and your allies. Well, what happened is that because of these terms, the Meccans actually broke the terms of the treaty, kind of inadvertently. And because of that, the treaty got broken in the following year, in Qur'an year 20, and allowed the Prophet the freedom, the flexibility to do what he always wanted to do, which was to return back to Mecca. Now, the mnemonic for the return to Mecca is this notion that in Qur'an year 13, when the Prophet, peace upon him, if we look down here, when he was making the Hijrah from Mecca to Medina, you have to realize that the Prophet, peace upon him, he didn't want to leave. It was very painful for him to leave because this is all he knew. By this age, he's 53 years old. He's lived in the city his whole life. His ancestors are from the city. In fact, his direct ancestors, Ismail, Prophet Ismail, alayhi salam, and Prophet Abraham, peace be upon them both. He didn't want to leave the city. And so there is a verse in Surah Qasas, which many scholars say was revealed to the Prophet when he was leaving the city of Mecca to go to Medina. And basically, I'm paraphrasing, Allah is saying, don't worry, because I'm going to bring you back to the place that your heart longs for. I'm going to bring you back to Mecca at some point. And if we go along this opinion, we can say that the Prophet, peace be upon him, had 20/20 vision, complete certainty that one day he would return to Mecca. So the mnemonic is that he had 20/20 vision that he would return to Mecca one day. And that return to Mecca happens in year 20 with the conquest of Mecca. So the conquest of Mecca is a very important event. The Prophet, peace be upon him, marches with 10,000 followers, because at this point the community had grown and grown and grown. Hudaybiyah had brought in peace and allowed the Prophet to create allies with other tribes. The community had grown to a huge amount, and they came to Mecca after the Quraysh broke the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and they essentially it felt like they surrounded the city. It's almost the opposite of the Battle of the Trench, where the Muslims were terrified that they were going to get destroyed. Now you have the flip thing. So here was Trench in 18, conquest of Mecca is kind of the flip scenario in year 20, where now the Prophet, peace be upon him, has this huge forces that are effectively surrounding the city of Mecca. And the Meccans are terrified. Oh my gosh, what are they going to do to us? Because we remember what we were going to do to them when we had them surrounded. What is the Prophet going to do to us? The Prophet says famously in the words of his coach, Yusuf, Prophet Joseph, he says, because when Joseph, and I want to go through so much. When Joseph saw, and if you know the story of Joseph, when Prophet Joseph, peace be upon him, reconciles with his family, he says, there's no blame upon you today. Like, you're forgiven. Don't worry about it. So the Prophet says, in the words of Joseph, he gives the same gesture of generosity to his people of Mecca and says, I know you're expecting to be destroyed. That's not how a prophet behaves. And today I'm forgiving all of you. And it was a huge gesture of mercy that the Prophet showed these people. And because of that, they couldn't believe it. They were overwhelmed by his nature, and they were overwhelmed by his message. And so pretty much all of them embraced Islam after the conquest of Mecca. Now, that's in Quran year 2020 vision. What happened in Quran year 21? In 21, so after the conquest of Mecca, the Prophet, peace be upon him, returns back to Medina, because now his home is Medina. He promised the people of Medina he will always be with them, and he returns back to Medina after the conquest of Mecca. In year 21, the Prophet is starting to hear that the Roman Empire is upset and worried about this growing power that's growing in Arabia. They're hearing about these stories about this man, Muhammad, this prophet, who's bringing a message, and the numbers are growing and growing, and they're feeling threatened. Now, the Roman army is the Roman Empire is a huge empire that's been there for millennia, or maybe not millennia, centuries. And at this time, the two big powers in the world, as in this area of the world, are the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. And Arabia is kind of like south in between the two, the Peninsula of Arabia. And no one really went to Arabia because it was just desert and sand. It wasn't worth it. The Romans were fighting, the Persians were fighting. Now, I don't know which is left and which is, when you're looking at me, I think this is left and this is right. Okay, so the Romans and the Persians are butting heads, and they've been butting heads for years and years and years. The Prophet in Arabia is down here, and they're a growing power. The Romans don't like that, and so they're worried that they're going to maybe be a power threat to them. And so the Prophet hears that the Romans, now we call them the Byzantines, but they were known then as the Romans. Historically, that's the more accurate term, is to call them the Romans. The Prophet decides that we have to go take on the Romans at their own border. Now, this seemed like berserk to like the Arabs. Like, who are we to take on the Roman Empire? The Prophet said, no, we have to do this. And so, in Quran year 21, he marches to the city of Tabuk in Quran year 21. Now, the mnemonic for this is that in year 21 is the age of full-grown adulthood in many societies. It's the age where you can drive and you can vote and you're kind of like on your own, year 21. So in the same way, 21 is the age of full-grown adulthood for the Muslim community. They go and they push the boundaries of things that the Arabs have never done before. And so what the Prophet does, he marches with tens of thousands of believers to the border with the Roman Empire, to this place called Tabuk, to take on the Roman Empire. It was inconceivable to the Arabs, because the Arabs had never unified around a single person before, and now they had unified under the Prophet's leadership. They go to Tabuk. The Romans actually never show up for the battle, but meanwhile, the Prophet secures a lot of alliances on the march up, then in the Northern Territory on the way back. And by this time, the Arabs and the rest of Arabia hear what happened, that this man named Muhammad has a message, and he is solidifying and unifying the rest of the Arabs under this banner of monotheism and this banner of social welfare and humanitarianism. He is changing the fabric of Arabian society, and the people who are giving the Prophet peace be upon him a hard time are realizing, look, if you can't beat him, then you got to join him. So what happens in Qur'an year 22, look at the mnemonic 2 and then 2, this sign, this often means peace, right? So now think 2 and 2. Qur'an year 22 is the year of peaceful delegations. So we're going to write here peaceful delegations. This is the year of the peaceful delegations. All of these now, after Tabuk, like no one can kind of resist the Prophet, peace be upon him. And so in 22, the remaining Arab tribes around Arabia start pouring into Medina. Mecca is no longer a threat, and now all these other places start pouring into Medina, forming alliances with the Prophet. These tribes are converting to Islam, and now most of Arabia is now entering into the fold of Islam. And this is a very amazing moment, because remember, just a few years ago in 18, the Muslims thought that they were going to be destroyed in Medina, and now just a few years later, by year 22, almost all of Arabia has become Muslim. And so now we get to the final year of the Qur'an year timeline, and the final year is marked by two major events. First, the Prophet now makes his first Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. His entire life he wanted to make the Hajj pilgrimage the way Abraham did. And now the Prophet, peace be upon him, he makes the Hajj pilgrimage, and everyone now is in Mecca. It's a scene, just imagine a sea of humanity. The Prophet climbs to the top of the hill there. It's called the Mount Arafat hill, and he makes this amazing sermon where he kind of like leaves his lasting legacy to his followers, and he delivers some of the final verses of the Qur'an that were revealed to him in Surah Al-Ma'idah, saying, look, this day the religion is perfected. Like, this is it. We have done this job for 23 years. Not only have we fought for our rights and fought for the rights of the people who are less fortunate, fought for your right to recognize who your creator is and learn how to worship him properly through all this difficulty, right? Let's take a look at this. Private, public, Abyssinia, Hamza and Omar, these very difficult ban years, the year of sadness when his wife and his uncle passed away and he got chased out Taif, the Isra and the Mi'raj, amazing moment. He set the stage with the Aqaba pledge for the Hijrah. Then he goes to this difficult time in Medina, only to be ended with Hudaybiyah. He goes through this conquest, taking on the Roman Empire at Tabuk, peaceful delegations, and now at the Mount of Arafat, he delivers his final sermon. And he explains to people, this was the point of your faith. And he delivers so many important messages in that thing, and maybe we can get to that at some point. He delivers some of the final verses of the Qur'an to be revealed, and he performs this, what's called the farewell Hajj. Why is it the farewell Hajj? Because in year 23 will be the death of the Prophet. And so we will write here in 23, the farewell Hajj. Hajj and death. And you don't really need a mnemonic for that because it's the final year of the Prophet's life, and so you'll remember that that was the death of the Prophet. So this, my friends, for those of you who stuck with me, and I applaud you for sticking through all of these things, you know so much of the story of the Prophet's life, peace be upon him, so much of the context of how and why the Quran was revealed, and you have it, I hope you have it locked in your head. In the next episode, what I'm going to do is I'm going to review this whole chart with you. I'll quiz you on it, so I want you to study this tonight. That's your homework for the next episode. And if you need some more kind of help, you can watch the previous episodes. Go to therevelationexperience.com. You can download my free Quran Your Timeline tutorial. Share it. Teach this to other people. Sometimes I found that the best way to learn things is by teaching it to others. It forces you to really master it yourself. I will see you guys in the next episode, inshallah. Can't wait to see you then. Assalamu alaikum.